for our next project, we're going to do a trivia game just to sort of apply some of the things that we've learned about arrays. So if I go down here, the first thing that happens is I'm going to invoke or call the main function, right? And that's just a menu in our while true loop. And the escape sequencer value is going to be Q. Otherwise, they can choose M or P to run multi-dimensional quiz array or a parallel quiz array. So this quiz is using a two-dimensional array. This quiz is using a parallel array. Let's take a look at the first quiz, okay? And the first quiz, we have some local variables declared inside of our quiz multi-dimensional array. Here we have a two-dimensional array, and it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows. And within each of those rows, it has 1, 2, 3, 4 columns, okay? Can you see that? So inside this parenthetical expression, these outer parentheses represent the combination of rows and columns, right? So remember, a multidimensional array is an array that holds other arrays. Every element in that array holds additional arrays, could be one or more. In this case, for a two-dimensional array, so the first element, outer of our outer element is itself an array. And that's in these inner parentheses, separated by commas. And within these inner parentheses is our second array. This is our columns, right? So again, follow row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then as the rows go down, the columns are in double quotes, 1 separated by a comma, 2 separated by a comma, 3 separated by a comma, 4. So 5 rows, 4 columns. Now remember, the index or the subscript value is always going to be off by 1, right? Humans start counting at 1, PowerShell starts counting at 0. So let's go through this. And we're going to display using a multidimensional array for the quiz. We are just going to pause our game. We're not doing anything with this input here, calling read host. We're just pausing our program flow. But we do need to catch the return value. So we don't want to break a window with that baseball. So we'll just assign it to null. We're not going to do anything with it. We don't care what the player types in. We just told them to hit enter, but they could hit any key and enter, and it would be just fine. So then here's the meat and potatoes. This is our trivia quiz engine, okay? So from this opening brace down to this closing brace, and you can barely see how ICE highlights it. But here, I'll just highlight all the code. Okay, so from here down to here, this is our quiz engine, okay, for our trivia game. So let's see what happens. We have a variable x. We initialize it to be 0 in the initialization phase. All right, the condition or test portion, as long as x is less than q include a dot count. Well, that's going to return the number of rows, right? The number of elements. So how many? 5. So x is going to loop 5 times because here in the action portion, we just have a postfix increment. But rather than counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, remember that off by 1 with arrays, it's going to count 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, okay? Now to make it more user-friendly, we'll add a 1 to our x, so that way it'll say question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 instead of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. But the index or subscript value is going to be this, right? X will have, the first time we repeat our for loop, x will have a value of 0, right? It starts out as 0. So that's this first row here, row 0. And then column 0 is what? That's our very first column, right? Column 0, column 1, column 2, column 3. It's 4 columns, but 0, 1, 2, 3 is how we count them. So it's going to display the question, El Día de los Muertos, right? And then after it displays the question, we're going to get some input using read host as a string value. We're going to convert it to lowercase, and what are we going to do with it? We're going to store it in our two-dimensional array. This time, in the same row, the first row, but the last column, the fourth column, but it's indexed with a subscript value of 3, right? Because it's off by 1. So fourth column, indexed by 3, that's where we store what the player types in. Now we just need to be able to compare what they type in and we store here, and based on the question we asked here, to the answer to the question, which is right here, the second column of every row. So we're going to simply retrieve, the value that we stored, and we're going to tell the player, you said, and then in that fourth column, indexed as 3, but it's the fourth column, we'll repeat to them what they said. And now we're going to test, right? So in this if block, we're going to say, hey, in this case, is the answer, right? 0 right now, we're still on the first row. And the second column, right? Column 0, column 1. So here's the answer. Octubre, or October 30th, right? If that is not equal to, and then Q include an A 03, the last column, that's where we stored what they typed in, what we got from read host, right? So if what they type in, if it's not equal to, if it doesn't match the answer here, the answer column, they got it wrong, right? They didn't guess correctly. And so if they get it wrong, this whole block of code is what is executed here. And likewise, if they were to get it right, okay, then this whole block of code would be executed in our else block. So let's say that they get it wrong the first time. What happens? We increment total wrong guesses, add 1 to it. We increment wrong per question count. These are postfixed increments, but we do it first, so it doesn't matter. In our if block, we're going to say wrong per question count if it's less than max wrong guesses. Well, is this the first time they got it wrong, or is this the third time they got it wrong? Because remember, we didn't hard code it, but right now, the value of max wrong guesses is 3, so we're only giving them 3 wrong guesses. So if wrong per question count is less than max wrong guesses, we're going to say, sorry, that was wrong, and we're going to display a hint. And notice the index subscript value. So again, this is the first iteration, so x would have a value of 0. And column 2, so it goes 0, 1, 2. So this third column here, but indexed with a subscript value of 2, that's going to be a clue or a hint for that question. So we drop them a hint. And here, we're going to postfix decrement x. And why? Because we want to cycle back to that question again, right? Based on the value of x, that affects the question that we ask. And not only does it affect the question that we ask, but where we store the player's answer and what we compare it to, what the actual answer is, and what the hint is. All of that has a relationship with or is based on the value of x. So if they get it wrong the first time, and we need to allow them to ask, another chance, we have to decrement x to roll it back to basically counteract the default action that's happening in our for loop, which is an increment. So that's why we're decrementing here. So we're basically rolling it back to keep it asking that same question, right? Because the player got it wrong. Okay, that's if it's less than max wrong guesses. Now, if it's not less than max wrong guesses, we're going to tell them, hey, sorry, player, you've exceeded your maximum number of wrong guesses, and move on to the next question. Okay, and that's if they get it wrong. Now, what if they get it right? If they get it right, this block of code is what gets executed. We'll tell them, hey, that's it, you got it right. Add 1 to square, add 1 to right count. And we have a Boolean here. This Boolean starts out as false, but the reason what we're using this Boolean for, we need to reset the value of wrong per question count for each new question. Whether they got it wrong and they exceeded their max number of guesses, or if they got it right, when we start the next question, this is keeping track of their wrong guesses per question. So say they guessed 2 wrong guesses and they got it right on the last guess. Well, if we don't reset this, we'd have a logic problem, because then when we rolled around to the next question, it would, our PowerShell would assume, hey, they've already had 2 wrong guesses. Do you understand what I'm saying? So we have to reset this for every question, whether they move on to the next question by getting the question right and not exceeding the max number of wrong guesses, or whether they didn't get the question right and they exceeded the max number of wrong guesses. Either way, we have to reset this. So that's what we're using this Boolean for here, okay? And the reason is, okay, well, we have a compound statement here, right? We're using an or, okay? So, both sides don't have to be true. Only one side has to be true. But what we're saying is, if wrong guesses per question count is greater than max number of guesses minus 1, because remember, it's 0, 1, 2, not 1, 2, 3. But in this case, well, they've exceeded their max number of guesses, and so we need to reset the wrong per question count. Or if their guess was correct, and we set that to be true here, either way, we need to reset wrong per question count, and we're also going to change our Boolean and set it back to false. And the reason we have to do that, you might be saying, well, why don't you just reset wrong per question count here in this block of code when they get it right? But the problem is, if we did that, where that executes, if I reset it here, we would get an error in our display down here. So, at the end of each question, whether they get it right or they've exceeded the max number of wrong guesses, we're going to give them these 3 stats: the total wrong guesses, and wrong guesses for current question, and questions answered correctly. So, therefore, we cannot reset this before we call the right method here. Does that make sense? So that's what we're using this Boolean for, and there's probably at least a dozen other ways you could code this, but you have to think about those logic issues. You have to think about how you're going to handle them. When you display something, and when you reset something, and when you need to reset something. So by and large, your greatest issues are going to be logic issues. Syntax errors are pretty easy to fix. The ICE will help you with that. The development environment, PowerShell, will help you with that. Any good IDE will help you with syntax. And you can track errors down to the line number and the character number. But probably the more challenging things to debug in your program are, your code may be syntactically correct, may function, may work, but it doesn't do what you want it to. You have logic issues, and that's where you need to hone the skill of being able to step through your code and think like the computer thinks. Think like PowerShell thinks. Now, we'll take a look at using the debugger in later videos too, and that can also help you. But for now, I want to keep our, when we only have a few colors on our palette, and we don't have that many tools in our toolbox yet, I want us to get into the practice of being able to step through code, line by line, or in a loop, iteration by iteration, function call to function call, and sort of flow with the code and think the way that PowerShell thinks, think the way that the computer thinks when it's running that code, okay? So get to the end, and again, we're not doing anything. We don't really care what the player types in. The only purpose of redos here is to pause the program flow. So, but we do need to catch that return value, so we're just going to assign it to null, which is, we just chuck it in the garbage and throw it away. We assign it to null. That does what we want. And then go back up to our for loop, and now x was 0, now x is 1. So now it does the same thing with this row, right? All that same process, loops again. Now x is 2, 0, 1, 2. Does the same process. Loops again in our for loop, and the next row. Loops again in our for loop, and the next row. Does that make sense? Okay, and finally when we're done, when this has done its job, our quiz engine here, then quiz 1 complete. And we have a final score. We're going to multiply it by 20. And then we're going to plug that into a switch statement. That's our final score. And we're going to assign a letter grade, based on how they did. So 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. Then we'll exit. And again, we don't care what the player types in. We're not doing anything with the input. We're just pausing program flow until they hit enter. But we do need to catch that return value. And if that's fuzzy or you've forgotten, go back and watch the video on functions and functions with the return value. Okay. So we need, in this case, we need to catch that value. So let's run this code and take a look at our trivia game. At least the multi-dimensional array portion of the quiz. So I hit enter to start, right? It's going to ask me the first question, El Dia de los Muertos. Let's say that I get it wrong. September 15th, okay? So, it's counting my wrong guesses, total wrong guesses. Haven't answered any correctly yet. That looks good. Logic flows the way we want. Here's my hint. Same month as Halloween. So now that I know it's October, I'll roll over again and let's say I guess October the 31st. But no. Okay, so wrong guesses for current question is 2. My total wrong guesses is 2. I haven't answered any correctly, so that's good. Here's my hint. And on the last attempt, I guess October the 30th, okay? So in this case, yeah, it looks good, right? I had 2 wrong guesses, but I got it right on my last guess. And my total wrong guesses so far is 2. And then if I hit enter, it rolls over to the next question, my favorite game. Let's say that I guess chess. And in this case, here's a hint, maze-like first-person shooter game, video game, right? So my wrong guesses for this question is only 1. That was my first wrong guess, but my total wrong guesses is 3. I hit enter, and let's say descent 3, you got it right. Okay, so I got that on my second guess. So my total wrong guesses is 3, that's right. My total wrong guesses for this current question is 1, that's right. And questions answered correctly is 2. And then, again, my wrong guesses per question counter is reset, and it rolls on to the third question. Best science fiction series ever made, BSG, that's it. Wrong guesses for this question 0 because I got it on my first guess. Questions answered correctly 3. Total wrong guesses 3. Okay? And what if I get one wrong? Basket weaving. Fishing. All right. And I'll say hunting. All right. So in this case, my current status total wrong guesses is 6. Wrong guesses for current question is 3. Resetting wrong question counter. Why? Because I didn't guess that one. So I've got to roll on to question 5. Popular vacation destination, Florida. Hint, Jaman on the beaches. So, okay, that's it. You got it right. So I answered 4 out of 5 questions correctly. My total wrong guesses was 7. I only got 1 wrong guess on this question. So logically, it does what we want, right? And then I get my final score. I got a B, right? An 80, a B. Got at least 4 right. Okay. So, I'm going to go ahead and quit that. So, that's a trivia game with a multi-dimensional, in this case a 2-dimensional array. Now, the next thing we're going to do, use a parallel array. And essentially the behavior is the same, but instead of 1 array, to achieve the same thing, I'm going to need 4 arrays. And they're going to have to maintain a vertical or parallel relationship. So, at this point, can you see the usefulness, right? And sort of the efficiency of a multidimensional array? I'm basically taking 4 arrays and I'm coding them in one array. If I use an array with rows and columns, a 2D array. But if I use a 1D array, I can do the same thing, but I need 4 separate arrays. And each of those arrays has to maintain a relationship, a parallel relationship. Each element in one array has to correspond to all the other elements in the same position, the same subscript value and index value of all the other arrays, right? So in my first array of questions, the most lethal maneuverable dogfighter America ever made has to correspond to F-14 Tomcat. And of course I know that you might argue, I'm sure you have your own favorites, who knows, but the point is, I have to maintain this relationship, right? So element 0 here, the question, has to correspond to element 0 here, the answer. Has to correspond in the third array to the hint. This is our hint, right? Still element 0. And the player's input. Okay? So when jet fighters meow. And we'll look at this, okay? How's the code changing? How's it different? Again, we pause the program flow. We don't care what the player types in, but we catch it in null. Here's our for loop. X starts out as 0. We're going to postfix increment. Questions count, right? There's 5 elements in all 4 of our parallel arrays. And then, okay, so questions, we're going to ask the question. That's the most lethal maneuverable dogfighter ever made. Okay, that's our question. We're going to take the user's input and we're going to store it here in our first element using read host. Now we're going to compare it. And same logic here. If what they've typed in is not equal to the answer, and the answer is F-14 Tomcat, then what? And we're using to lower, so because our answers we're comparing to are all lowercase, so we don't care if the player types in matter of fact, that should be, make sure that's lowercase because they could never get that right. I have to make sure all my answers are lowercase because I'm calling to lower here, so the player doesn't have to worry about case sensitivity and when they answer the question. But so we store it here in this array, right? User's input, and we compare user's input to the answers, which is this array here. Okay, and if it's not equal, same thing. Add 1 to wrong guesses and wrong per question count. If wrong per question count is less than max wrong guesses, if and only if they haven't exceeded their allowed number of wrong guesses, sorry, that was wrong, and give them a hint. And same thing, postfix decrement x, the variable x, so that rolls the question back. Even though we postfix incremented it here, we postfixed decrement it here, so that keeps it hovering on the same question. So we can ask the same question again 2 more times if necessary, until we've exceeded the maximum number of wrong guesses, okay? And actually, I should be using my Boolean here. I shouldn't do this here, but I'm going to leave this in the code. And using the first function as an example, you can see where I used a Boolean. I want you to fix this logic error. I left a logic error in this function with the parallel arrays. So I want to see if you can fix that logic error. You have this example here of how to do that using a Boolean. But the problem is where we're resetting wrong per question count. We shouldn't do that here, right? Because when we do that here, it's going to give us erroneous output here. We want to do it after this, but if we do that, you're going to have to make this a compound test using the logical OR, and maybe introducing a Boolean variable. So you have an answer in the previous function that we went over, but I'd like to introduce a few logic issues in these programs, in the source code, so that you can. I want you to be able to step through it and modify it and sort of fix those issues, I guess. I think it would be a good exercise. But okay, so other than that, the logic is the same. Okay, same thing we're doing with score, but My personal preference, I'd rather use a single two-dimensional array and I can achieve the same results than to have to use 4 separate one-dimensional arrays. You see what I'm saying? So does that perhaps make the case for the usefulness of, of multi-dimensional arrays? I think it kind of shows, how when you combine them with the repetition structure, you can do a lot with just a little bit of code. So let's kind of run this game. And okay, so most lethal maneuverable dogfighter America ever made, and F-14 Tomcat. That's it, you got it right. Total wrong guesses 0. Wrong guesses for current question 0. Questions answered correctly 1. And enter again. And of course I can cheat because I have all the answers here, but who is the harbinger of death that actually saved humans and Cylons? And everyone knows that was Starbuck, right? And it doesn't matter that I typed in a capital S because what am I doing down here? I'm using the to lower method to convert everything to lowercase, okay? And I compare it. Yeah, you got it right. In the end, it doesn't even matter. That's Lincoln Park, right? I am so cheating. Okay, sci-fi novel by Isaac Asimov that introduced 3 laws safe. And that was I, Robot, remember? I, Robot. Yeah, you got it right. And the last question. Quantum theory that allows instantaneous FTL or faster than light communication over any distance. And that would be the concept of entanglement. Okay. So questions answered correctly 5. And I'll just go ahead and exit there.